Thank you for joining us for this informative American Institute of Chemical Engineers webinar sponsored by Providence Consulting, Back to School, How to Avoid the Training Brain Drain. Our speaker is Sarah McDuffie. Sarah McDuffie joined Providence Consulting in 2015 as Training Program Coordinator, creating internal and external training courses for industry clients on various process safety management topics. Her background includes 19 years of experience in the refining chemical industry. She has a BS in Chemical Engineering from Montana State University. Her 11 years with a major refining company included project design, process unit support, and distillation consulting roles. She completed her master's in adult education and training with Colorado State University in 2011 while working for Northern Oklahoma College as an engineering instructor for 5 years. One quick note before I turn this session over to Sarah McDuffie, as described more fully on this slide. The American Institute of Chemical Engineers assumes no legal liability or responsibility for the use or misuse of the content in this webinar. And now I'd like to welcome Sarah McDuffie. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, thank you, Pam. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. The title of this presentation is called Back to School, How to Avoid the Training Brain Drain. And we're going to talk about 5 ways to train to proficiency. So first I want to talk a little bit about why I'm here and tell a little bit of my story. I've always loved teaching and had decided it would be easier to become an engineer first and then go back to teach than do the other way around. And after a really rewarding engineering career experience, I decided to pursue a master's degree really so that I could be more effective in the training that I did for my job. And 2 years into that degree, I had an opportunity to teach at a college, and I decided that teaching in a classroom would be a really rewarding experience, which it was. I completed that degree while I was teaching engineers and future operators with the PTech program, and then recently got married, moved to a different state, and took on this role here at Providence. And one of the things I really enjoy about my job here is I get to focus on my favorite aspect of my master's degree, which was instructional design, creating courses. And that's what I'm really hoping to do today, is to help share some of that knowledge. And that brings us to why are you here? And the 2 objectives that we listed in the promotion is that we want to help you and introduce you to 5 steps that are going to help you develop effective training and really focus on creating and measuring proficiency in your learners. And you see those 5 steps highlighted here. We're going to obviously go into much more detail as we proceed. I would like to talk about the brain drain itself. What is that? And this is something my algebra student gave me my first year. And we think about this when we think about training at times. But the brain drain is really about pouring resources like your time, money, and effort into training that doesn't have the desired results in the learners. It just kind of goes in one ear, out the other, or does not really show up as a long-term benefit to the bottom line. And it can look differently in different situations. It may look like it doesn't apply to me. If you've ever sat in a training and you thought, this isn't really relevant to my role, it's not useful to what I need, or I already know this stuff. It might manifest itself as a too much drain where there's just a cognitive overload. You stop taking in the new information, it's just too much to process all at one time. Maybe it shows up as, I don't understand. If you've ever sat in a class where it was confusing and you realize, I did not understand why the instructor just did what they did, I wouldn't be able to duplicate that or really connect it to what I'm supposed to be learning here. Maybe it was too long or boring. We've all had instructors who just read the slides or really just had one-dimensional training where you didn't get to have any hands-on practice. Maybe it's just not enough breaks and opportunities to stop and think about what you've learned and really apply it. And then lastly, it can manifest as just poor quality or ineffective. Maybe the materials or the delivery method can be distracting or hindering the learning. And so we really want to avoid these drains and the exploding brains, and so we can use a process. And those are our 5 steps. Let's talk a bit about the definition of training. This is one that I found. There's many definitions out there, but our job as trainers is not to just impart information. Our goal is to make sure the learners are proficient in what we set out to teach them. So we want to really sharpen their skills. We want to help them be able to discern and make decisions. We want them to develop in their thinking or understanding. And who is the trainer? Well, I'm assuming if you're calling in here, you are. And so with most of the audience here, you're probably engineers with a range of experience levels. Some may be relatively new in the field. Many of you have much more experience. As an engineer, you're familiar with processes, with logical systems, which is why I think you'll really like these 5 steps. I know I really got excited learning them in college. You've got potentially a range of exposure to the education methodologies and theories that are out there. Maybe you've done some formal training in how to teach, and maybe you were just tasked with, hey, create a training course, and you're just going with the materials you have at hand and the knowledge that you've gotten up to this point. What I know for sure is that you each have your own teaching styles, your own passion for the topics that you have to teach, and your own stories to tell. And we really want to help you capitalize on that. Why are we training? There's lots of different trainings that you may be involved in. Maybe you're training new engineers or new hires in general. Maybe you're sharing your technical expertise. Maybe you're involved in safety training that's process safety management related, or personnel, different safe work practices. Or maybe you're in a consulting role and you're helping do training for your clients, whether it's getting them up to speed on a technical issue or some safety concern. And because we're a process safety management company here at Providence, wanted to just spend a short moment looking at PSM training specifically. And we've got here the 14 elements, and we've broken them down into 5 PSM mindsets just for simplicity to really help highlight the key aspects of the process safety management standard. There's a previous webinar that we gave back in January that really goes into detail here, but what I want to focus on today is where the training is, and we'll just spend a moment here. You see that training shows up in all 14 elements. Obviously, the training element is called out specifically, but even getting everybody on board in the very first element for employee participation, you've got to get everybody to some baseline understanding of PSM before they can really participate effectively. And you see that throughout, whether it's getting people aware of access to process safety information, or training people on their operating procedures, getting your contractors trained, doing training for changes before you do a pre-startup safety review, training people on findings that may have come from incident investigations or compliance audits, getting that communicated in a way that is meaningful and promotes change to prevent future incidents. So we see that all throughout the process safety mindset or management standards. So now in any training it's important to incorporate the learner's experiences into this discussion, so we're going to do that here. And I want to give you all an opportunity to fill out this poll. If you go to your chat box, you should see a little polling tab that's a drop down. And I just want you to type in there real quickly, what is a current or upcoming training project that's on your plate? And just a couple words is fine. And that way we can all kind of see the various things we're working on here. And just a little short time. And there we go. So we've got It looks like maybe didn't give enough time, or maybe you're not used to putting on the chats, and that's all right. We've got some other polls coming up here, and want to make sure that you're able to answer those. But again, most of you have very a variety of things that you're involved in. And I want you to keep in mind of that project, whatever you have in mind, as we go through these 5 steps and try to see how can you apply these 5 steps to your project. We'll be walking through an example of teaching piping instrument diagram training, and so we'll apply each step to our training as we go. So how can we train better? Well, typically we train how we've learned. If we were lectured to, we tend to use lectures. If we were taught using PowerPoint slides, that's going to be our go-to format. Computer-based training is common, although that's not usually something that we are familiar creating as engineers. The trend now is moving to mobile devices and micro-trainings, like small segments of training. We basically build the training like we've seen it built and what we're most familiar with. However, in the field of education, there's much that's already known about the brain, how we learn, methods that are effective for teaching, and really some great ideas and theories out there to help people learn new things. And as I mentioned earlier, instructional design is a field that looks at that methodology of creating training. It's all about process flows, steps, optimizing, and that's really a chemical engineer's dream. So what I want you to do is approach your training like you would approach a process design. So our first step is going to be review the needs and the learners. Why are you doing this, and who's going to be benefiting from it? And in process design, it would be asking the question, what is the problem statement? Why are you doing the project? What are the real issues? What's the data telling you? And your learners would basically be comparable to your equipment and the process already in place. What are its capabilities? What are its design criteria? And what are the limitations? So when you're looking at training, ask yourself, why are you doing this training? What's the real need for the learners? Is there data out there to help you verify that? And who are the learners? You know, who's the existing equipment that you're working with? What are their prior experiences and skills and their limitations? Our second step is to look at the objectives. What are you wanting to teach? So again, in a process design, what should the new equipment or modified process accomplish? Are you looking for more throughput? Are you looking for better quality of product? Are you creating a new product? You know, what exactly are you wanting to do? And in teaching, that looks like, what do you want the learners to be able to accomplish when they leave your class? Is there a specific skill they should be able to do, a new set of knowledge they should be able to apply and analyze new information? Or do you want them to have a new behavior or a new attitude going forward? Our third step is going to be assessment. How are you going to measure success? So in process design, if you're looking for more throughput, you're going to make sure you have flow meters, and maybe you put in product and intermediate sampling. You know, on a distillation tower, you're going to look at temperatures and your temperatures off your exchangers to look at efficiencies. The same thing with your learners. How are you going to measure that they are proficient? And we'll spend some time on different ideas for this. And do you need sampling just at the end? Do you want to find out at the end, or you want some intermediate type of sampling of their progress? The fourth step is content and delivery. So now that you've determined your goals and what you want to accomplish and how you're going to measure that, now it's the part of seeing what equipment is needed to accomplish those, looking at material selection, your vendors, plot plan layouts, etc., all the details of the engineering design. Likewise, in your training, that's the part where now you're pulling together all your resources and slides and information, your your videos and demonstrations and all the content you're going to use to teach your students. And lastly, you want to evaluate the content. In your process design, it looks like, did we meet design specs? So you go back, you look at your measurements. What about your economic impact? Did it give the benefit and the rate of return you expected? Did you address the real issue at hand? Did you meet your constraints? Did you stay on budget, stay on schedule? And again, when you're teaching, you're looking at, did I meet the need that I identified in step 1? And do I have some ways to measure that and really evaluate the change in the learners and the economic impact to your organization from that change? So let's start and delve into each step in a little more detail with the needs in the learner review. So again, this is why the training and who's it for. And when you're looking for the underlying need, it's kind of like looking for the root cause of failure. You just keep working your way back to what's at the core of the problem you're trying to solve. And then can you tailor it to your learners? They're going to get more from the training, which is the whole point, when you fit it to them more specifically, when you fit their needs and constraints. When you're looking at the need and trying to determine that why you're doing this course, ask yourself a couple questions. What makes you think there's a need for this training? Maybe somebody just came and said, you go give a training on XYZ, but is that really what is needed out there? Is it, or do they just need better equipment or better software? But if there is a need for training, how can you verify that? Can you put some data to that need? This makes it much easier to evaluate the training afterwards if you've got data before. For example, when we started our 5 PSM mindset training here at Providence, we did multiple surveys, we did interviews with clients, we used observations from our staff and their experience with the clients. And one of the things that came out was, one quote captured it best, that there was a chasm in PSM understanding site-wide, that there were 5 people in the PSM group trying to influence 600 people at the facility. And so we saw the theme of facilities really wanting to get their people all on the same page with PSM and how it related to their job. And that's really what gave us the indications of how to move forward with our training. And what you want to keep doing is keep drilling down on that need until you find something that really fuels your passion as an instructor. We don't just saying we have to have mandatory PSM compliance training may not really get you excited unless you're the one that OSHA comes to and asks if you've done the training. But thinking in terms of we can help change people's perspective and their participation in PSM if we show them the intent behind the OSHA document, that can really fuel an instructor's passion more if you can see how you're going to transform the learner. And moving on to the learner next, who are these people that need the training or who you're going to be interfacing with? What kind of job training do they have? Are they engineers, operators, inspectors? What's their level of experience? Maybe what's their area of experience? Perhaps they're very experienced in, say, one unit, but now they've moved to a different unit and don't have as much exposure there. And what kind of previous training have they had? What are their constraints? A lot of times scheduling is a constraint. Do they have access to the computers or tools that you need to review? Do they have access to the field? And then finally, what's their goals and expectations? What are their reasons for attending? Even if it's mandatory, they probably have some expectation of what they want to get out of it or what they hope they survive through. And what you want to do is help take them to the next level. So again, this is kind of fueling that passion for you as an instructor. How is your training going to help them reach their next level of success? So here's our example of our P&ID training development. And when we first identified the need, we had clients where new employees are coming in, unfamiliar with P&IDs. The learners are new engineers, operators, inspectors, and anyone basically that has a need to interpret and review the P&IDs. They have limited experience in the facility since they're newer, and they may or may not be familiar with the equipment found in that facility. All right, so let's move on to step 2, the objectives. What do you want them to be able to do? And again, because this is a doing, you want to use action words. And this slide here we'll spend a few minutes on. This is Bloom's taxonomy. This is a favorite tool of educators, and it's very useful in helping you find action words and really understand what level are you asking your learners to perform. So when you start at the base of the triangle in the remember phase, that's really like a beginning level. So for example, in chemistry, you may ask them to remember elements from the periodic table or list them. And then you build up your levels of cognitive skills until you reach the top of create. And so in that case, you may be asking a PhD student to develop a new chemical compound. So it's really a from beginner to expert progression. And to the right, you see some more descriptor about each of the levels. And then other example action words. This certainly isn't a comprehensive list, but just things to help give you ideas for your training project. You know, a lot of times we use the phrase, well, I want them to understand X, Y, Z. But what we really want them to do is be able to apply it or even analyze. I want them to be able to troubleshoot. It's not enough to just to say I want them to understand distillation, when what you really want them to be able to do is troubleshoot a distillation tower. Well, analyze is the 4th step up. And so it helps you to recognize this, and it really informs how you're going to assess your learners, whether you're looking at something at the bottom of this triangle or something closer to the top. And this slide was from the Vanderbilt University Center. There's lots of them out there if you do a web search. Now you may need to break down your objective into smaller steps. So here's a non-engineering, well, more mechanical engineering example. I want my learners to be able to build a fence when they're done. Okay, that's implementing a skill. That's the 3rd level of applying on Bloom's taxonomy. But there's a lot of things involved with building a fence. So first, they need to determine the fence material to use. Then they need to calculate the amount of material needed. That's really an apply step. And determining is the analyzing step, really the 4th step. And then lastly, assemble the step. And each of these steps may also need a little bit of extra breakdown that you may not need to write out, but need to recognize. For example, if I'm determining the fence material to use, first I need to know what material is out there and available. So I need to be able to list material options before I can compare and contrast. If I'm going to calculate the amount of material needed, I also need to know how to measure the fence perimeter to calculate that. And then thirdly, for assembling the fence, I may need to discuss assembly techniques, tools, equipment. So for our example, as I add my objectives for P&IDs, I want them to be able to evaluate the P&IDs against field configurations. So first, they need to be able to identify their P&ID symbols. That's a remember step, a very first level. I want them to interpret P&IDs, be able to recognize what's happening as they look at a P&ID. That's an apply step. And then finally, I want them to do a 4th level analyzing, compare the P&ID versus the field. And that will prepare them to be able to evaluate, which is a 5th level of Bloom's taxonomy. Again, don't get too caught up in the levels, but use that tool to help yourself think through how proficient, to what level do I want them to perform. And now we move on to assessment. How am I going to measure the proficiency, and when am I going to measure it? This, most of the time we jump straight from the objectives and the steps and we start throwing our content together because that's really fun. And I start gathering my resources. But if you will decide on your assessment plans before you create the content, what that really does is help you ensure the content supports the learning, supports your objectives. And you will be able to teach to the test because you'll know that you have created some meaningful test, quote unquote, or assessment tools that will assess their proficiency. So how am I going to measure that? There's 3 different types of proficiencies. There can be cognitive, which is knowledge-based. I want them to know something, learn something. That's really what Bloom's is, very cognitive-based. So I might use a written test, quizzes, oral question and answer discussions, maybe case studies, tabletops, and we'll show more of these later. Psychomotor, maybe I want them to do a physical skill, a physical activity. So I might test them using hands-on demonstrations, field walkthroughs, mock events. And maybe it's an affective or attitudes and behaviors. Maybe then I can use surveys or case studies, look at participation metrics. You know, who's chatting, who's not, who's involved. We're most familiar with what's called summative or after the fact assessments. And it's most common what you think of like in a college course or maybe safety training, operator qualifications. It's typically higher risk, so this is, you have to pass this test or this walkthrough before you are given your certificate or your degree. And it's usually comprehensive, looks at the entire picture. Now, here's some common tools that you'd be familiar with. But even if your training doesn't require a certification or some kind of high-risk test at the end, it's usually very useful to have a final assessment activity to see where the learners are at, to help them show and demonstrate they can do it for their own confidence level and for your assurance that the training was effective. So you can use field walks and checklists, maybe have them do a demonstration, and again, some of the other more common methods. There's also an opportunity to do formative assessment that happens during the training. And these are really little reality checks for the trainer and the learner. They're usually real low risk, so there's no grade or pass, fail associated with it. This is really common. You'd see them in CBTs where there's a little quick quiz before the final quiz at the end before you move on to the next section. And then you want quick feedback, so you see whether you were right or wrong right away so that the learner can modify their approach, and also gives you an opportunity to see, are people engaging, are they understanding where you're at. And it also gives them an opportunity to reflect, to consider how well they are learning the material, what's making sense, and also address any questions that they have at that point. Some of those tools could be quiz or polling questions. We're going to actually use one of those here in a minute. There's lots of tools available out there that are free. Poll Everywhere is a great one, but there's many different tools that you can search online. Discussion questions, not just does this make sense, open-ended questions, but questions that help demonstrate, okay, what do you understand so far? You can practice the activity using practice sheets, case studies, field walks. One key to these is really to discuss the results and see how people perform. You know, look for clues where they're maybe tripping up or missing a concept. It can be really powerful to have learners share what they're learning from the exercise after they've completed it. You know, ask them, was that easy or difficult? What was the most challenging part of the activity? What questions maybe do they still have? And get creative on these formative assessments. They can really help engage the students. And if you need ideas, if you go online and search formative assessment examples, there's a plethora of ideas out there that have been tested and work really well. For our P&ID training development, as we add the assessment here, our overall assessment the comprehensive summative was to have them go out into the field and trace the piping and compare with the P&IDs and identify those errors. But you'll notice each each step has its own assessment. So in asking them to identify P&ID symbols, we did a quick quiz of just quick fire questions showing the symbol and asking them to respond. Is that a gate valve or a globe valve? And that type of questioning. For interpreting P&IDs, they had partner work. They were self-assessing with some answers, and so they had little handouts. And then comparing P&ID versus the field, we first did an indoor exercise using photos and the P&IDs for inconsistencies so that they could have a little less stakes and more comparative and discussion time indoors before they went out to the field for their final assessment. So this is the opportunity for you, this polling example. Which formative assessment tool could work for your project? And you can pick more than one here. And something that you might be interested in. Polling questions, discussion questions, case studies, practice sheets, or maybe some other group activities or group interactions. And think about, is there one of these that you, or more, that you could incorporate to really strengthen your training going forward? And this is an example of, obviously in a webinar, I don't have time to ask for more detailed answers. If we were in a different format, I would be asking you to apply each of these steps. And here's the results of the poll that you can see. So yeah, lots of different options that are out there, and they all have their purpose and unique benefits for classes. So let's moving on to the content and delivery. Fourth step. So this is the fun part. Yay. You really want on your content to pare down to just what's needed to meet the objectives. If you have too much content that doesn't really tie directly with what you're talking about, it's just going to confuse your learners. And think of movie editing. They may have some really great scenes that end up as deleted scenes because they really don't serve the bigger story. So it may be really great content, really great information that you're like, I really want them to know this, but it doesn't tie close enough. It's just going to add extra weight. And maybe that's a training topic on its own for next time. And delivery asks the question, what delivery is going to fit the learner's needs and constraints? So going back to that first step of your learner review and saying, are there ways that I can get around the constraints by how I deliver the material? And we'll talk about some options for those as we go forward. So talking about content and diverse content, our goal as instructors is really to bring people to the subject. And the best way to do that is to use as many connecting points as possible. And one connection is going to be industry knowledge. This is the content we typically, especially as engineers, go to first. It's the foundational things they need to learn. If you're learning about a relief valve, you're going to go look at all of the material that's been generated in the past by other engineers. And you can give them resources and links, references to further reading, and lots of content there. Another great opportunity for content are your visual demonstrations. And this helps people see. It gives them something to visualize for their brain to build a model around. If you've got it built a new unit, there's usually a 3D model that was generated with that. That's a great example. Maybe you can do an in-person demonstration, or you can utilize videos. YouTube has a great amount of videos on safety videos, or you can watch it happen, like what's going on inside a pump or inside a compressor, things you can't usually do in the field, but you can do through video. CSB videos, the Chemical Safety Board videos, are fantastic resources for showing what went wrong and why, and really giving an in-depth visual on the topic at hand. Hands-on practice lets them make a physical connection with the content, even if they're just writing down on a practice sheet, writing down their thoughts on a subject. That's making a physical connection in their brain as they're doing an activity. Doing case studies using simulators, computer simulators. Maybe you've got a small-scale demo unit, or even being able to go out in the field with the actual equipment. And then peer experiences. You want to give opportunities to share experiences and let the students connect to each other. It's a great way to utilize your learners who have more experience. They can share their stories and their insights. And if the whole group is relatively inexperienced, for example, a new hire group, then you as a learner, or as the instructor, you can share your stories of what's happened to you that you've experienced, or what's happened to others in the industry. So again, that's we use the CSB videos often for our safety trainings. And then finally, connecting to your own experience. Give the opportunity for the learners to connect what you're learning and to apply that to their current or past projects or to what they've already seen, and just help them build on that. And we're just going to, it's hard to nail down just one, but we're going to have a quick poll here. What's the connection to the subject that is your favorite? Like if you think of past trainings, which one of these has been your favorite to you? So take a second, if you will, and answer in the poll. And a lot of times it's hard to decide which one is the best. I've had great aha moments through each of these connection points, and they really need to work together. You could share peer experiences, but if you don't have the foundational industry knowledge, it could be misleading and unreliable because your peers may not have the newest information or had the best training. If you have really awesome visual demonstrations, but you're not connecting it to their work, you may just be entertaining them. And I'm not seeing the results of the polling here, so we may. The poll has ended. There we go. Hands-on practice is definitely the highest amount, and that's one of my personal favorites too. And with that in mind, ask yourself, is your training giving that opportunity? And if not, what can you do to incorporate some hands-on practice? Great. Thank you, everyone, for responding. Delivery options. We can do online, which is very flexible, or you can, whether it's their computer, their mobile device, they can access it on their own time, but it's also very isolated. You can do one-on-one, kind of a mentoring, or you're with your small group, on-shift discussions. This is you really can connect learner and instructor, but it's very time-consuming. And you can do large group, which is connecting everyone together fantastically, but it can present scheduling challenges to pull everybody aside for a whole day or even a few hours. And really a great idea is to use a combination. Try to use the strengths and minimize the weaknesses of each one. So an example might be use online content as pre-work, bring it together, bring everyone together to discuss applications, and then follow up with individuals or the work teams. And so as we look at our example, we've got our content for the P&ID, and then we just used our delivery, whether it was in class, out in the field, and we kind of talked through that earlier. And lastly, we're at evaluating the training. So you assess your learner, you evaluate your training. You can evaluate as you're forming the training material. Again, there's that formative word. And you can summarize it after the training is complete. For formative evaluation, do things like trial runs, peer reviews, sample testing. Try to let some people who fit the learner profile review your training before you give it. Find out what's working, what's not working, so you can improve it before you complete it. And then your summative evaluation at the end, this is your chance to do that before and after comparison. You can use surveys again. Maybe give a pre-test and a post-test. Since we're not trying to train to a grade, you could give the same test at the beginning and the end and see how they perform. Did it improve? And a pre-test really keys things in learners' minds as to what to be looking for and highlights what maybe they don't know going in. Look at the other metrics and data that you first reviewed in your needs review, and can you look at those same metrics afterwards? And then finally, a time element. Most of the time we give surveys right after the course, but what about following up a few weeks later to see what they remember from the course and what they're still utilizing? Following up in a few months or a year to see if those improvements are sustained. And all of these can help you determine if the training really met your needs to begin with. And as you'd expect, our formative, for our P&ID training, review the website with the peers that we use to facilitate training. And then summative, we had an online course evaluation, much like we'll have for this webinar here, and a supervisor follow-up. So again, we want to avoid that train brain, the training brain drain. Avoiding that doesn't apply to me. Make sure your training fits the needs and the learners. Don't make it too much. Narrow it down to a few precise objectives and steps. Make sure that they're understanding by helping create assessment tools that is going to demonstrate that proficiency to you and them. Keep it from being long and boring. Use some of those brain-friendly content delivery methods to help them connect to the subject. And then make sure it's not confusing or ineffective by evaluating that training before and after. And hopefully you can look at these steps and apply them to your projects. And as before we head into the Q&A here, I just want to ask you, what step are you at for your current project, and what step or steps might you want to explore further? Remember, there's lots of resources available on the internet for any of these topics that you want to delve into more deeply. And with that, I want to thank everyone for taking the time to participate and use the polling and for participating in this webinar.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. If anyone has a question, please send it in the chat box to host, and I'll ask our speaker. First question, is there a way to tell if my training is adding to the bottom line of the company?
So that goes back to the evaluation and really to that first step of needs assessment. If you're able to determine what the real issue is and how that's detracting from the bottom line. So for example, we need distillation training, and we've determined that because we just have a lot of flooding issues and tower upsets. Well then, when you go back after the training, you can look at those and see, are we having fewer upset incidences? Are we able to manage that troubleshooting and the tower performance better because of the training? So sometimes it's very straightforward like that. When it's things such as attitudes and behaviors, it may be a little more challenging to tie to the bottom line. For example, doing management of change training, but you can look at the participation, you can do management of change audits and see, are people filling it out more effectively, which often ties to the bottom line if there's less rework or less mistakes made. But sometimes those things are harder to tie. It really depends on what type of training you're doing and how well you've identified the need at the beginning.
Okay, thank you. How do you handle students with varying experiences?
Right, that is often a challenge, and particularly happens, for example, if you're doing operator training, you may have some operators who just started, and you've got operators that have been there for 30 years. And really the key there is to tap into the experience from the operators that have been there a long time, or the engineers, or whoever it is that you're training. Use them to, ask them about their experience and their stories, and you have to be careful not to let certain people monopolize a training. But once you kind of engage them and say, hey, share your experience with us here, they feel more of a partner in the learning. Whereas those who have less experience, look for analogies maybe of how they can connect the material, from their former job or previous. Everybody has experience with something that they've done, and ask them, does this tie to things you've done in the past?
Okay, thank you. How can you effectively use a pretest to gauge baseline knowledge?
Pretests are really fantastic and kind of underutilized, but when we first did the mindset training, we used pretest and a post-test. And one of the questions I asked was, can you list the 14 elements, the OSHA elements, from memory? What ones can you measure? And people would list like 2 or 3. And then we used the post-test afterwards, and we had spent quite a bit of time in the training focusing on those elements. Afterwards, people were only missing 2 or 3 of the 14. So the pretest on its own, you really just need to set that up of what are some key things you want to know about them, their prior experience. So you can ask some questions that you think everybody should know and verify that, and then ask some questions that you don't expect them to know, and that would really give you an idea before, and then you can compare after.
Okay, thank you. How do you successfully make it through the dreaded after-lunch trainee fade?
Oh, yes. Definitely coming back after lunch is a challenging, and that's a really good time to use some of those formative assessments where you're maybe do a little quick refresher in case they forgot everything over lunch, but then do a tabletop exercise in small groups, or some sort of case study. If you choose to watch a video, or make sure it's something engaging, maybe explosive, so they're not droning on, that they won't fall asleep. Maybe there's an opportunity to do a walkthrough, but something that's kind of an activity that will keep their blood going a little bit.
Okay, thank you. What theories about how people learn are the most important?
What I've read and seen so far in the industry, first off, giving people opportunities to reflect on how they're learning. It's called metacognition, basically understanding how you're thinking, is really important. It really helps learners if they recognize, I'm understanding this because it's visual, or I'm understanding this because I'm able to do some hands-on, or just reflecting on what does this mean to me, and how do I apply this to my situation. Anywhere in your brain that allows the brain to connect it to previous mental models, previous experiences, it's going to last longer. And the other thing that has come out is that more exposures, lots of little exposures over time, as opposed to one big dose once and for all, helps learners, because again, you're getting that repetitiveness. So that's a common thread that I'm seeing, is kind of a low dose, high frequency learning approach.
Okay, thank you. When you use CSB videos in process safety, do you purge their "we need more regulations" recommendations?
No, I usually don't. I let them run all the way through, but I usually emphasize, and help ask the question, okay, could this have happened at your facility? and really focus on how can we regulate ourselves. But no, I don't typically purge that part of it.
Do you have any valuable tips for the training facilitator to avoid the facilitator themselves becoming the boring component of the training?
Absolutely, because that is very tempting, and there's a lot of things that can contribute to that. If you've given the same training over and over, in college, I'd be teaching the same class 6 times, and it can get monotonous because I've done this before. But really, the two things to really tap into that have helped me is first recognizing what, kind of going back to one of those slides of let that need fuel your passion. What gets you excited about that subject? Why are you even teaching this in the first place? If it's like I've got expertise in distillation and that's why I'm teaching, well, what gets you excited about distillation? What gets you excited about polymers, or whatever your expertise is? And then 2, what can you tap into about the learners? Taking them to the next level, looking for those opportunities to engage with them. Where are they at? And really, finding out people's backgrounds at the beginning, asking them about projects they're working on or issues they're having helps you connect with them. And so the teaching becomes more of a dialogue and a conversation, not just you standing up there, being a talking head. And I find those two things, really focusing on my passion for the subject and my desire to see the learners grow and develop. If I keep those in mind, it keeps me from being boring and uninteresting.
Okay, thanks. In your opinion, is there a tool for determining or validating need that's worked best for you, and why?
I think, as we showed, there were several different tools. I like to use multiple if possible. Surveys are great, just an online survey, because you can send that out to a large swath of people and hopefully get quite a bit of responses back, and so you can get a big breadth of response. One-on-one interviews are fantastic because you can really dig in deeper and kind of ask them more questions. But if you're wanting to, you can't really do one-on-one interviews with 100 people, but maybe you can pick a few, 3 or 4 to sit down with and do those interviews. And then again, asking people their observations, what do they see, can be effective with surveys. But so it really depends on who you're trying to reach out to and their availability.
Okay, thank you. Can you recommend any scheduling tools to help schedule trainings for shift workers?
That is definitely a challenge, and I confess I've not found, partly because that I'm not involved in the scheduling process. Usually, whether it was in our own facilities or working with client facilities, there's a scheduler who's working those out. But we have found it challenging to. It's easy to get your engineers pulled aside for a day training or even a half-day training, but I'm afraid I don't really have a good answer for the best way to schedule the operators.
Okay, thank you. For non-technical leadership topics, training often uses role play to simulate leader-worker interactions. The results are dreadful. Either the role player is combative in their approach to portraying the worker, or a doormat that does not show how to portray the worker. So I'm not sure if there's a question in there or that was a comment.
Probably the question would be, is there a better way? One tool you might consider is a case study where you present them with a scenario of, they read a story of here was the leader and here is the subordinate and here was their interaction, and then ask them to critique that. What would you have done differently? How could you, role play is great in some instances, but I agree, especially with people who maybe aren't comfortable with it, you get really mixed results based on the participants. So being able to critique from the outside, whether it's a video example, or like I say, you can type up a case study. Then you can really hone in on the actions and activities that you're wanting to focus in and let them critique it and give ideas. How would you do that differently?
Okay, thanks. Have you ever used a job task analysis to determine training needs and objectives?
I have not done that specifically in my roles, but that's definitely a great, a good starting point to see what people have to do and then where to start with their training. So yeah, that'd be a fantastic tool. And I would also add on there too, polling the employees too and asking where do they want to grow, what areas of development do they want to see, gets them more engaged in their training too. If it's, they really want to head towards management or they really want to specialize in this technology, finding that out helps as well.
Okay, thank you. Do you believe in getting away from the podium, or do you stand there and read from notes?
It really depends. When I was teaching differential equations, you can't really get away from the podium because you really got to work through that material. And so there's times when it helps to be, you want to tell your experiences, you want to share your stories because that's not experiences they would have had yet. But switching back and forth, giving the opportunity for them to engage, getting opportunities for them to get into groups and discuss things really helps. Or depending on the type of course and curriculum, getting them up in front of the podium. That works well in college settings, maybe not as much here, but sharing from their seats is really great too. So I'm not one for burning the podium, but trying to mix it up as much as possible is best for the learners, I think.
Okay, let's see if we could get one more. And how can we handle second language limitations?
That's a great question. I don't know that I have a good answer for that, except to maybe give the second language students opportunities to go look at resources on their own as well, so that they can spend a little bit more time, reading, and if they need to, look at a dictionary. More times I remember my friend from Russia saying she would take all of her college stuff, record it, and then go home and compare with the dictionary so she understood what things were there. So giving them some access to resources beyond just sitting and listening to your lecture so they can really engage with the material as well on their own time.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. I'm sorry that's all the time we have for questions. So if anyone still has a question and they would like Sarah to answer it, one way to do that would be to send it to me at producer@aiche.org, and I will forward it. So now on behalf of the American Institute of Chemical Engineers and everyone who attended today, I'd like to thank Sarah McDuffie for this very informative presentation. Thanks also to our participants for your cooperation and thoughtful questions. Please visit aiche.org to replay this webinar or to view and sign up for our many others. A reminder to also please fill out the evaluation form that will appear on screen when you log out. Goodbye, and we hope to see you again in a webinar soon.